So we're just going to pop on to the next one we have along here. Before we get started, it might be worth reintroducing ourselves of Avolution. So for those of you who are less familiar, we provide a tool called ABACUS to deliver enterprise architecture. We now have been running for about 20 years after being founded in 2001 over at the University of Technology over in Sydney. We now have 7 offices worldwide with 3 global head offices throughout. With one being opened up in Virginia for the America region, Sydney for Australia and APAC, and then finally for EMEA, there's a London office based as well. And from this reach, we now been able to reach over 100 different countries and therefore 3,000 different companies. And one thing key to mention as well in this is that we've been named as the leader in the Gartner Magic Quadrant and the Forrester Wave as of the latest reviews. So today on the presenting team, we have myself. So for anyone who doesn't know, my name is Scott Davidson. I'm one of the sales consultants based over in London for EMEA. And from the same office, we also have Andrew Luthwaite, so our pre-sales lead, who'll be presenting the main topic today. So just before we get started into the main part of the presentation, I wanted to show a brief overview of ABACUS and some of the terminology you may hear today to make it a little bit easier to follow along. So as you can see here, ABACUS is made up of 2 fully integrated platforms. So these are connected by a collaboration server and run off the same centralized repository. So this creates a single version of truth throughout. So the first of these 2 platforms is ABACUS Studio. Now, as you can see on screen, this is the heavy lifting part of the tool. So you'll be configuring your meta models, creating your viewpoints, and setting your users and permissions. And then if we branch out, if you will, into ABACUS Enterprise, this is really the pretty leaves of the product, where you can see your rich dynamic visualizations, interactive dashboards, and this can be based on the decision analysis performed in Studio. So when you hear these terms today, hopefully it'll give you a bit of an understanding of what we're referring to. And I suppose it's time to really get into the meat of the bulk of the presentation, and we'll switch over to Andrew, who's going to kick off, I believe, with what is Agile.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Scott. And yes, welcome everyone. Thanks for making the time today. As Scott mentioned, this is part 2 of our series of WebExes. So if you do have any further topics that you'd like us to discuss, as Scott mentioned, please feel free to throw those into the chat window as well. So for today's topic, in terms of Agile and how Agile works alongside enterprise architecture, it's not an uncommon topic. It certainly comes up most times we try to do these WebExes, and it's certainly one that we want to focus our time on today. And really the best place to start with what is Agile is probably just stemming back to its origins. So Agile itself as a term, I guess has been around for a while. It probably gained the biggest popularity, let's say, when it actually became its own type of manifesto for things like software development. It's probably over 20 years ago now. I think that was back in 2001. And really the values here and some of the principles that developed around software management effectively stem into other types of methodologies and frameworks. So things like Scrum and Kanban boards. These are the types of things that you'll usually find and go hand in hand with some of the Agile values and the principles that are in that type of manifesto. As much as that was focused on software development, of course, it was a case of trying to have an iterative development method for software. Certainly that principle for iterative development of software was probably 30 or 40 years even before 2001. But certainly a lot of these things still hold true today. Very quickly on those 4 values that you're seeing here. So individual interactions, working software, customer collaboration, and responding to change. And maybe there's a misconception here that those are typically taking over from the things on the right-hand side. But really, this is always just a trade-off. You understand that you're choosing the best approach for the best situation. And that's really where and why the Agile methodology was initially described. What's happened more so these days is that we have variants of Agile. So Agile really has, I guess, in some ways fractured from its initial development around software Of course, this has moved into other areas now. And really what we're seeing these days, I guess, is partly down to the word agile being put in front of almost every word and assuming that then becomes the practice. Typically, you'll find that's the case when people are talking about things like agile projects and programs and processes, agile capabilities, agile teams. It's a dangerous concept to just throw the word around in front of those types of areas. And really what we want to focus on today are some of the key areas where agile becomes much more beneficial alongside something like architecture. Really, the idea here is to kind of avoid that branding, so agile brands. There are some kind of wider terminologies I've certainly heard, enterprise scrum, you have extreme Kanban, squadification, discipline agile delivery, all of these brandings of agile probably do have their time and place in some organizations who are developing their own agile methodologies. But it's important to get back to what the actual use of this is. And so from today's perspective, what that really means is as much as it was also a software development methodology and probably still is, it obviously stems into more around project management. But really the key principles here is having some kind of collaborative, lean and adoptable methodology that can be applied to various organizations. It's probably no surprise as well that in terms of some of the analyst reports and in terms of some of the surveys, it was over 90% of senior executives giving Agile high priority on their list of things that they want to adopt. And again, some of the reasons there come from the benefits of Agile, but there's always the danger that you're falling into the category of doing Agile for Agile's sake. And so really, from that collaborative, lean and adoptable process, there are probably three things to keep in mind as we keep going through these slides and explaining how this can be adopted. So the first is really around the customer. So really one of the laws of Agile and certainly how it should be implemented is customer is the focus. So delivering value to the end customer, whether it's internal or external. The second key thing is lean, so around having smaller teams. So you'll always hear around an Agile terminology around self-organizing teams. Of course, there has to be a vision there and what those teams are doing, but having those smaller teams carrying out more focused work, again, delivering values to customers. And the third thing is really this network, this collaborative approach to all of these areas, making sure that these smaller teams are interacting with each other. They're all focused on working on the same products. There's a shift away from a top-down approach here. And again, coming back to that first principle, always trying to increase value for the customer. So if we actually look side by side at some of the differences and some of the similarities between Agile and Enterprise Architecture, there are going to be crossovers and there are going to be times when they may butt heads. And certainly there are pros and cons to both of these areas, but we certainly don't see these as separate topics. These are effectively a spectrum of things and benefits that you'll get of combining both of these. So there are some more traditional views, things like enterprise architecture might prioritize a lot more on the process side. There's a lot more upfront requirements for architectures, always trying to complete something like a baseline before moving to some future states. These are some of the ways maybe more traditional EA has worked in the past. And Agile can come across as almost like a silver bullet, being able to adapt to changes quickly, and then moving away from these big upfront requirements to shorter term products that people are actually working on. The key thing is that both of these approaches focus on the outcomes. They're both driving towards ideally the same goals around making things more effective and simplifying the business. And it really is having a huge emphasis here on the importance of relevant data. And we're going to be talking about that later on in terms of the ways we can capture some of this and where we actually use the data within the organization. So if we were to look at some of the headline ways of how and what an Agile EA practice actually looks like, these are some of the key things that have come up across our customer sites and some of the things that we've found quite useful to keep in mind. So the first thing, of course, is customer focused, continuous delivery, and in making sure that that customer is satisfied, again, both whether that's internal or external customers. There's the key aspect here of just enough architecture, probably something you've always heard in a few of our WebExes before, but really it's not trying to do everything at once, making sure that you have enough of that architecture to answer the questions. The third thing here, no big upfront design in favor of flexibility of changes. Now, this is important, and it's something we'll discuss a bit later on when we look at the ways we actually model within ABACUS. But really, the idea is there's always going to be some kind of design for any of the products that you're building, any of the services that you deliver. The key here is being able to be flexible around new requirements that come in, and that is true to the last minute, so that you don't become focused too much on a single thing without being aware of all the changes that might come down the line. The fourth in here is the value across the entire organization. The more traditional approach of kind of project-based work, a project gets started and gets completed, that typically becomes a bit outdated in the sense that we're always trying to deliver better products and services. A project is maybe building one of those, but it's a continuous and iterative approach for adapting that over time. Things don't necessarily end when the project ends. If anything, they start because we're working on it even further now to continuously deliver value for the customer. And the final thing in here is true collaboration. So that's collaboration with customers that you're delivering services to. That's collaboration within any of these individual smaller teams that have been set up. And it's collaboration within those teams as well. So making sure everyone knows what work is being done and how that's actually being delivered as a product or service to that customer. There's probably a bit of a misconception, I think, at times as well with larger organizations, how maybe large financial institutions can't be agile because they're maybe ingrained in their ways. But even if you look at some of the biggest companies, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Google, Netflix, Microsoft, they all have and do work in this agile way. I'm sure you've heard of Jeff Bezos's 2 pizza team mantra. That's exactly where this stems from. So they might not brand themselves with agile terminology, but they're working in one of those true agile fashions. The other key thing in here as well is trying to make sure that agile falls in line with agility. So it's both operational and strategic content that we're working on here. Again, for any of those products or services that we deliver, it's not just one aspect, it's both. So if we do start looking at Agile and EA together, what are the actual benefits we're going to get out of that? And these benefits can translate to things that naturally occur by adopting a more agile methodology, but there are also areas that we can do some work on to improve each of these sections. Now, again, if you think along those 3 headers I mentioned earlier on, the customer, the small teams, and network collaboration, then these are all benefits that are going to come from each of those areas and provide benefit to each of those areas as well. The important thing for each of these steps that we go through is, again, Agile is usually a cultural and behavioral change. It's not a tool that you can put in place. It's not really necessarily a system you can just impose. It has to be a cultural shift in terms of how people are actually working. So if we jump into the first one here, a clear vision. Now, of course, this is important. At the beginning of any piece of work, we actually want to understand where we're trying to go. The key here from an Agile perspective is that flexibility. So even if we've defined the vision, our end goal, we have to make sure that we have the adaptability about changing how we reach that goal, maybe even changing that goal as new requirements coming in. So part of defining that vision, of course, is who's involved in this product or process. What is it that we're actually trying to achieve here? So again, we have different goals: increasing customer satisfaction, maybe reducing costs, making a larger market presence, perhaps. These are all things that we need by defining that vision. And it's also what Agile methodologies can help bring to any EA team. So this is a fundamental first step. It's essentially how we can start organizing the business, organizing our teams, and making sure that they are clear in terms of their output. Some of the key steps that actually help with defining that vision is, of course, integrations. And when we start looking at the way we define the work in terms of different teams, usually we have to work on parts of that data that we have already within the organization. And that data could be spread, across the entire organization in multiple teams. And what we really want to do is centralize that at the beginning. So agility here should mean that we can centralize the information, making sure that each team has that data to start modeling, to start building these views, and start understanding how they can actually adapt this going forward. So really capturing that information is one of the key things in here. The second aspect is if we really are working in a more agile fashion, then we do have the ability to have more effective data maintenance. So maybe in a non-agile perspective, there are multiple siloed pieces of information. There are 15, 20 different teams who are trying to work on the same thing. Really, we want to make sure that there's a central repository for this information and really trying to make sure that we only use the data that's needed. So again, coming back to the principle of just enough architecture. So there's a few things in here that I guess are quite common. Certainly customers that we work with, whether that data is in ServiceNow, whether it's in Technopedia and Excel spreadsheets and other tools, you have to try and centralize all of this so that you have a clear understanding of what you actually look like today. So this kind of current situation, it does obviously vary over time. As an organization, you're looking at keeping that up to date, but there are various ways of actually maintaining that information through automated ways, rather than maybe the more traditional way of manually updating the data. A key part of this, however, is making sure that there's enough focus on that vision. So focus on the areas of concern. So if you are working on increasing customer satisfaction, reducing technical debt, reducing costs, you need the right data to make the right decisions, and you should be focusing on a few of those key areas. Part of that is capturing some of these KPIs. So of course, you have to measure something before being able to change it. And that's a key aspect of working within this architecture team. From an agile perspective, one of the key aspects in here around data maintenance is this almost becomes self-fulfilling in these smaller teams because you are no longer needing to branch out so much into all of the other areas of the organization to gather this data. You can have it centralized within your teams. You can make sure that you can provide updates on this. You're all on the same page of exactly what data you're working on. So it makes that vision clearer and it makes it much more effective to maintain that data, which traditionally would have been quite difficult. So understanding where you are, understanding that vision and providing that information, one of the other fundamental steps. What we then actually take a look at is how we can actually analyze that data. So combining something like Agile and EA does tend to give us a slightly more efficient way of analyzing the information. One of the key aspects here, of course, comes down to populating the data. But really from this perspective, if we can actually centralize this and communicate this throughout the organization, we should leverage existing tools. So tools aren't silver bullets to any of the issues. They are there to essentially provide a helping hand. And so by making this data accessible internally, sticking it in Confluence or Teams, making people aware of all the information that's in that tool, this is a fundamental aspect of actually analyzing that content. So who owns the data? That's one of the key aspects. Maybe who has access to the information, maybe analyzing some of the systems you have for risk or security. All of these things can help with these types of processes. The other key aspect of making this available is to kind of shift the ownership onto the data owners rather than maybe on traditional aspects on the architects. So again, by allowing people to maintain their own information in a centralized repository, so that's both trying to help define the vision, efficient data maintenance, and now allowing you to analyze that information in a centralized repository. So again, it's important to make sure that that is accessible. But realistically, from an analysis perspective, what does that actually mean? So we talked briefly earlier on around different KPIs and different use cases that might come up. And really what we actually want to do is leverage existing data sets to build analysis on top of. So when we have information in the organization around maybe the criticality of our systems, maybe the cost of some of the processes that we run, maybe the lack of capabilities to deliver new services. This is really where we should be using some kind of algorithmic approach to help us determine some of the outputs. So with all that information that we've maintained so far, we can actually start scoring things across that data set. So there's a couple of things that we've mentioned in here. So business fit and technical fit scores, complexity analysis, availability and reliability. All of these are likely to change depending on the use case, but using the power of no code within a tool will efficiently allow us to build these types of analysis. Now, what that really means, again, is from that data we've already captured, if we have cost details, we might aggregate those up and down the stack. If we're looking at building a real understanding of the criticality of all the processes we have, we need an understanding of what they're connected to and how we can actually build analysis on top of that. So typically in an organization, we're really looking at the questions. Does this technology make us more efficient or quicker to market? Does this change make us more reliable? Does this increase customer satisfaction? Are these new products and services viable? Some of those questions are typically answered through using these no-code algorithms. So really what we're trying to do here is have a deterministic output. And it's one of the key areas where we see most of the data being used across our customer sites. There are some more cutting edge methodologies you can use as well. If we're really talking about working in an agile way against EA, what we can actually find ourselves doing is leveraging things like machine learning. If we have gaps in our data, that might slow us down. We may not know the answers right now. So we can use technologies like machine learning that can help fill in those blanks. So from an agile perspective, we're not only maintaining data we know, but now we have the ability of actually finding information that we don't know. So both of those possibilities are there. So the no-code approach for deterministic, so formula-based ways, and machine learning for some of the smarter algorithms for how we can actually adapt and find information which we may have not had at the beginning. The next one is around decision making. I mean, this is an interesting one because in terms of the way we make decisions, we're going to be using that analysis that we've gathered throughout each of those processes. Now, from an agile perspective, really decision making has to be collaborative. We've talked about this in terms of smaller teams. We make those decisions within those smaller teams to deliver the right products or services. It has to be iterative. We make decisions today, but that shouldn't dictate all of the work we do for the next 6 months. This should be a process that we go through, changing decisions based on new data, new requirements that come in. And finally, any of those decisions that we make, if we work in an agile way, naturally become more transparent. Because again, keeping in mind one of those third principles we talked about of networked teams, is that all teams may have visibility of this data and the decisions that we're making. So all the stakeholders updated on any tasks that we're working on. It allows them to give feedback on the work we're doing, and it really allows you to make those changes and improve, rather than making a change today and finding out in 6 months that really wasn't the right decision. So collaborative, iterative, and transparent decisions is just a natural byproduct of working in an agile way. Keep in mind, though, that agile doesn't necessarily just equate to doing things quickly. So, it's not just building up as quick as possible, blowing up the budget. These aren't necessarily the principles of an agile practice. What it really means is making those smaller changes in smaller teams and not having those large upfront design projects that do tend to cost a lot, that do overrun, and maybe don't always deliver the value that's maybe promised. So again, decision-making is important. And you can see in here how those types of decisions can span across different areas. So this technology one we've expanded in here, decisions around what types of applications we should do, what kind of analytics are we running against that? Are there any security concerns? Do we open new digital channels, which is obviously a big topic in the last year or so? And then, of course, from an IT support perspective, that's something that's been one of the biggest challenges probably in the last year or so, And those decisions are changing daily. Whether it's remote support, on-site support, these decisions have to be taken quickly and transparently. One of the aspects of making those decisions is actually to plan what we call these future states or target states. At the beginning, I mentioned typically we're building something like a baseline or a current state. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that's exactly what you have to do and complete. The current state is never complete, but those target states should be branches off that. And really, these are small incremental changes that we're making. This is maybe a bit of a shift to maybe the old traditional way of branching off an architecture or a state that we're in, running some analysis and completing it, waiting for sign off, and then folding all of those changes back in. Those can work on specific projects or topics, but really what we're doing here is making sure that these transition states or these target states are slowly pushing changes periodically back to the current state. And so we have to make sure that when these changes occur, that we can actually fold those back in without needing to wait for longer periods of time for all of those target states to reach their end. So again, delivering value over time consistently rather than what some organizations might do, which is yearly. So really trying to focus on building those views. There are times, I guess, from an Agile perspective, it might seem like there's no need to plan and people think, oh, we're working an Agile way, we don't need to plan, we'll just react to all of the changes that come up because that's the way we built our organization. But planning really is important, especially for those situations where reaction isn't the best possibility. If you think of things like regulatory changes that come in, there's foresight there, when that's happening, the dates when those are going to be implemented. Just because you work in an Agile team doesn't mean you wait to implement those changes on the day of that regulation coming into play. You plan for that, you see how those changes are going to affect the organization, and then you are ready for any of those last minute changes that come in. So as much as there is a plan needed for some of those longer term views, traditionally you'll always want to build these target states. So again, defining that vision, making sure that we can maintain that data and building the analysis allows us to produce these future states. But what the analysis really gives us is the ability to perform some kind of trade-off. Now, if we are going through different transformation projects, perhaps we're working on things like technical debts, cloud migration projects, let's say, there's always going to be a case where we're trying to think of what is the best possible outcome. Just like with the 4 values from the Agile Manifesto, this is a trade-off. If we're building architectures for the future states for each of these projects or programs, we have to make sure that one architecture is maybe more efficient than the other. However, that other architecture might cost less. One future state or one transition state might be risk averse, but it really just increases the complexity throughout the organization. And so make sure that you go through these trade-off analysis techniques that you have an understanding of what that vision was at the beginning. What is it that we're trying to achieve? And these architectures can now provide some kind of guidance about reaching that. The other key thing here is, again, if we do have the ability to model these types of future states, if any new requirements come in that maybe rock the boat slightly, we can actually go through each of these and understand how that's going to affect the outcome. So again, really important to have these areas documented, because this is exactly how we can go through this type of performance scenario and effectively be very efficient in the way we actually deliver some of these results. So again, there are various organizations that actually take this approach. Some tech companies, some non-tech companies actually go through these scenario analysis. It's a fundamental aspect of trying to plan for the future, while again, making sure that you have the ability to make those changes where needed. The final aspect here is stakeholder engagement. A lot of this is to do with communication, really. Again, this is very likely a byproduct of working in a more agile manner. Again, if you look at those types of situations we talked about smaller teams, network teams, focusing on the customer, there's always naturally going to be more stakeholder engagement and more communication because we're making that data transparent. We have a clear idea of what we're trying to achieve by that vision. And we have these documented views or architectures about what we're actually trying to complete. But this has to be one of the most important steps. If we know what we want to achieve, but we can't communicate that, that's very likely to fail. So it really is part of these 5 stages, I guess, but it is one of the most important. And then we split this into these 4 types of categories. So awareness, who they are and the role they play. This is really just trying to understand that customer. So as I mentioned, internal or external, so customers you're delivering products or services to, customers in terms of stakeholders that need answers. You really want to make sure what role they play in the organization. Once you know that, that's when you can actually start managing some of the conversations that you have. The second is around context. So you actually need to understand what kind of area and how much knowledge do they actually need. So there's a balance here between finding if we have customers that really don't need to know all of the work they're doing and they just need to know the outputs, make sure that what you're displaying and communicating to that customer is in context of the issues they're having or the new products or services that you want to roll out. You don't want to lose your audience either by being too strategic or too operational. Make sure that there's enough coverage and depth of data there so that you can pull up where needed and drill down if more technical details are needed as well. The third is around the story. So obviously everything that you communicate has to be compelling. So whether it's around personal experiences, other projects that you've worked on, you really are trying to explain the work that you're producing and why you're doing that for a reason. So essentially grounding your audience effectively in that journey of trying to understand what you're trying to do and where you want to be. And finally, empathy. I guess understanding the challenges of customers. It's no good just going into these situations thinking you know what's best. Customers will obviously have some skin in the game here, but so do you. So you have to make sure that when you are communicating any of the views that you've created, the outputs you're trying to achieve, any of the services that you're rolling out, is this what the customer wants? You also need to make sure what you're saying is credible. This comes down, of course, to some of the KPIs we mentioned earlier on. If someone queries the reasons you're doing something in terms of you're reducing costs, give them those figures, give them those values. Maybe provide some kind of confidence scores. I'm 80% confident in my output here because maybe we only have 50% of the data available to us. If you can give me more data, I can increase my confidence of my output to maybe 90%. So it's a bit of a give and take here. This is more for internal customers usually, and where you have a need for information and really you want to give something in return. So this is all really around building partnerships, again, both internally and externally across the organization. Having all of that available means it's still probably not the easiest case to go forward. You still might have a difficult time convincing them that this maybe is the right strategy, and maybe they don't fully understand the situation. And one of the best ways of actually communicating this is giving them access to some of the content you've worked on. So make things accessible, give them the roadmaps of what you're working on, what are the timelines, what new capabilities or systems are we introducing? Allow them to see the work or the data that they've sent you, and then give them or produce these types of visualizations so they know exactly what you're aiming for. These could be very specific as well. You could be purely working within a process team. You want to adapt some of the capabilities that you've developed. You're extending or building some process maps. You want to understand more information around how each of these systems are interacting with each other, where the costs are, where the complexity is. All of that information can be quite difficult to convey. But if you have something visual, if you can lead someone through this story, you allow them to maybe provide feedback on the work that you're doing. This is the exact approach for working in this agile manner. Architecture might traditionally have been, we'll produce this piece of work and we'll just show you it at the end. This is an approach where it's more of a workshop approach. Let's work together on this piece of data. Let me show you what we've done so far. Be transparent about all the information that you've contained within these dashboards. That also works from a more technical perspective. Again, if we're looking at something like reporting on the resilience of our systems or applications, provide some of those headline figures. Yes, our portfolio of systems might not currently be that reliable, but in the future, based on the future work that we're doing and the work that we've made available to you, you can see how we're increasing that. You can see how we're reducing the complexity. Maybe we're increasing the availability of some of the critical systems. Having smaller teams that can bring this together quickly and display this efficiently is one of the key reasons that Agile and EA typically go together. So again, keep in mind those types of 3 pillars: the customer, the focus on the customer, the focus on smaller teams, and the focusing on networking those teams across the organization. With that, I will pass back over to Scott, and he's going to talk through one of the specific use cases here as well.
Thank you very much, Andrew. That's brilliant. Yeah, just as Andrew said, what we're trying to do is continue on from this and take a look at where this can be applicable in a use case. And of course, a key point to mention here is that there, of course, an abundance of use cases that this can apply to. But for today, we decided to look a little further into digital transformation. So just to set the scene a little bit with a definition, so we go with this and as how Gartner describes this as digital transformation can refer to anything from IT modernization, for example, cloud computing, to digital optimization, to even the invention of new digital business models. The term is widely used in public sector organizations to refer to the modest initiatives such as putting services online or legacy modernization. And thus they say the term is more like digitization than digital business transformation. So this, of course, is a very common use case for enterprise architecture and one that we've seen agile architecture used for as well. And this is potentially due to the ability to focus on stages of transformation as well. So if we're to look at an example here, you can see that you've sort of split up your views or dashboards here as part of the transformation process to focus on certain aspects of the use case. So here we can utilize several different portlets to understand some of the key stages of the project, whether it's looking at the processes or capabilities of said companies. So in this case, we looked at the top right-hand corner. So as we can see, sort of the complexity is increasing on this project over these stages of the case, and as well, the TCO is rising with this as well. But if necessary, we're able to drill down more into the individual stages and filter this for more information if necessary. So this can be done not only for the phases of the project if necessary, but also the departments that will be impacted at which time as well. So this again allows users to filter or focus on the step in progress for the appropriate people. So the second example we've chosen to look at for digital transformation as well is focusing more on the comparisons of applications and their key performance indicators. So these are listed again for project or transformation in this case. So you can perform this key decision analysis by having easy to compare statistics all on one dashboard. So this becomes easier when looking at a concentrated area. For this case, we're taking the KPIs could be total cost of ownership, availability, or even we've got unavailability in this case as well. So this allows as well for Andrew, as Andrew was talking about, these continuous live comparisons or reviews on these running projects. So a good quotation of how this has worked previously for one of our customers. So there's a company called Arup. So Arup is a British multinational professional services firm. They're headquartered in London, and they provide for all aspects of sort of built environment and construction. So they said for their major infrastructure projects, using IT modeling tools such as ABACUS enables us to take the complexity out of what is, in effect, an interconnected system of systems. So it also provides them clarity around the total scope of IT required for the project in terms of elements provided by different contractors and parties. So it's a key one to look at from themselves as well. And you can see from this quote the benefit of having a tool in place to assist this. and as they say, clarity around the certain projects as well. So to finish today, myself and Andrew always quite like to look at an analogy to hopefully summarize what we've been talking about and create something that will stick in your mind as well. So for today, we've chosen one that some of you already will have heard of, but ties in very well as we see it. And it's called Don't Pave a Cow Path. So the story goes, once there was a field with a lot of grass, and a cow came along and started grazing. So it looked about a foot in front of its nose and chose the most delectable blades of grass to itself and then started to munch on them. And the process continued until it had crossed the field. So a person came, wanted to cross the field at a later date and decided to step on where the grass was shortest, remembering the path on which the cow had munched. And in the process, this patted down the grass further. This went on until there's sort of a meandering, zigzagging, crisscrossing path, if you will, across the field. And the path followed that originally the cow had gone through. So what has this got to do with agile architecture? Well, if you are the person in this case and want to get something done, we'll take digital transformation rather than crossing a field. It's important to take the most direct route by focusing on the objectives or goals when mapping your projects, and not the path of least resistance, which in many cases is to potentially over-import or over-map out the information or data to try and cover all bases. So in this case, as well as crossing the path, you'll be stuck following the twists and turns, like the person in the story, of unnecessary data that you do not need to. So if you were to follow this, you can start to see the relevant analysis faster and more efficiently by having the focus around the end goal as well. So that really wraps it up for today's presentation. And what we'll try and move on to a bit more is a Q&A now. So please do shoot across some questions if you've got some. Andrew, if you've seen any particularly come through already that take your fancy.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Yeah, I can see some are coming through already. So the usual stuff about sharing the slides. Yep, of course, that's perfectly fine. So we'll start making our way through some of these. There's a question in here that asks, what's the link between the application, catalogs, services, application integrations? I'm guessing how all of these relate to each other. So that's probably stemmed from maybe a couple of slides where we've shown some of these views, and very likely we showed the application catalog in there. That's just really a way of maintaining some of the information. So those catalogs really are interlinked. If you're maintaining a list or a portfolio of applications, one of the things you're doing is maintaining also a list of interfaces or integrations. So of course, those applications and those integrations are modeled in a very similar way from an ABACUS perspective, just in the sense that they're treated in the same way. So they each have their own sets of KPIs or properties, and they both are modeled on various visualizations. And really the idea there is the systems themselves are probably easy to maintain. The integrations, however, might come from other sources. So that's where we've talked previously about adopting and integrating with other systems. So using something like the API in ABACUS to pull in lists of integrations or lists of systems that you're managing elsewhere to try and centralize all of that. That just falls into the service catalog as well in terms of the services that you're delivering and the applications that are required to deliver those types of services. So just one of those ways of managing the data. And you would have likely seen how that was done within something like ABACUS Enterprise as well, which is just an area where you can actually make sure everyone has the ability to see what you're doing and also contribute to that list as well. So it gives you a lot more control over the information rather than kind of hiding that away in an Excel spreadsheet somewhere. So there is another question here which we'll go for. So with the Agile Manifesto and how to work in a pharma business with standardization, documentation, and thorough planning are best practices. Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting one. I mean, from a pharmaceutical perspective, and even some of the things like healthcare providers we work with, regulation, of course, is top priority, and it's it's probably one of the things at times that maybe can stem progress, perhaps, on some of the things that have been done. Agile doesn't always have to just be something that you apply just because you want to. It has to kind of work in those situations. So from a pharmaceutical perspective, you could have various degrees of smaller teams working for, daily progress discussions and things like that. There are various things that pharmaceutical companies that we work with are doing as well, where they maybe have more of an increase of working with things like external partners. These are the types of things where maybe Agile becomes a bit more relevant. And I would say for those types of situations where things are highly regulated, don't just apply in a methodology because it's maybe the thing to do. It has to be effective and it has to actually work well within that industry. One of the biggest areas I think it probably helps with is around transparency. Having an understanding of what's going on in the organization, all the regulations that are coming into play, who's going to be affected by those regulations, that can be quite difficult. So architecture can help there, but more of an Agile perspective of having each individual teams responsible for those, providing that information, building those types of views, does kind of enhance the transparency across the organization. And that can be then an adoption of one of the best practices that you apply. Again, that's probably a question for other people to maybe to reach out to as well who work in that industry. But that's probably where I'd see Agile kind of working within that perspective. So we'll just go through a couple of others in here. So there's a question on, can you produce standard EA artifacts like TOGAF or DODAF or FIAF? So yes, this is probably more of a kind of a tool related question, I guess. So ABACUS has a whole bunch of different standards and frameworks that we supply, TOGAF being one of those, DODAF and FIAF being one of those as well. And there's a whole bunch of other notations and frameworks that you might want to look through. But really, those are the aspects that become quite useful. There's a interesting part of this, though, that maybe I just want to dive in on a bit more, which is to produce standard EA artifacts. And I think the idea here, if you think about the topics we've discussed today and how having the agility or defining some of the Agile principles works, don't just treat things as like a checkbox exercise, just because maybe TOGAF prescribes all of these different types of views that you should be creating. Something that we've emphasized before is, treat it as almost like a library or a Bible that you search for, and only start producing the views that are actually relevant for your audience and relevant for the use cases that you're working on as well. So again, it's important to have those types of standards, but there is a such thing as over standardizing on things. Just make sure that you're using the elements and parts of those models and notations or frameworks that are actually useful for you. There's quite a few questions in here, so apologies if we don't get around to answering all of these. We will, of course, follow up with you after. One of them is, how are you defining the difference between Agile and agility? Again, this is, I guess, an interesting one. I think, part of agility comes from working in an Agile manner. And the idea here is that you always want to be sure that you can adapt to changes quickly. We talked earlier on about different products that we might be working on and how new requirements might come in. And maybe from a traditional perspective, they would have to go right back to the start and redesign things, or they would just be ignored completely until the next release. The idea between Agile is it allows you to build in agility into those areas. So having the ability to make those changes quickly, effectively as well, not just reacting to them, but actually using that opportunity to make those changes. The other part of agility here comes down to maybe the customer as well, involving the customer, involving clients, contributing ideas and features and, let's say, functionalities to a product you're building. Being able to make sure that you have built-in agility to make changes, deal with those situations, is really part of where Agile comes in. I wouldn't necessarily call them two different aspects. One probably follows the other in most situations. Let's just see if we can get through one or two more of these. So are there any specifically Agile EA methodologies or training available? So we don't provide a traditional EA Agile training program, if you like. Those do exist. What I would say again is just be careful of using Agile as a driver for kind of branding's sake. There are a number of different Agile programs out there that can be really useful for trying to adopt something that can help you react to changes quicker, like we've mentioned. But really, the idea is see if this is something that's suitable for you. Typically, what you'll find that we try to emphasize when we look at working with customers from a product perspective is to leverage those multiple architectures or those scenarios I mentioned earlier on. So that is certainly one of the key ways that a lot of customers that we work with, and case studies you can find as well, that we promote the Agile methodology within ABACUS. It's that ability to start building future states, transitions, working on those, passing changes to and from those architectures, not just sitting on them until they're completed, but making sure that you have that ability to push things around quickly, making sure everyone is involved with the information that's going on, whether that's contributing or providing feedback. That's really where we would see providing best practices on Agile within EA, and more specifically within different deployments that we work with and different use cases that we have as well. There is a question in here which isn't in English, so I will pass that back off to one of our other consultants and he'll get around to answering that. But there are a couple of other questions in here as well that we would mind maybe just reaching out to some of you. I think some of these probably have more detailed answers than we can probably provide in the next 2-3 minutes. So it's certainly something that we'll do and reach out with some of the answers to those. One of the key things in here, I guess, that maybe has come across some of these questions in general is around how Agile can be applied to EA. So like we said, we can supply the slides, which hopefully gives you some background. But I'd highly maybe advise just taking a look at how these different methodologies might currently work internally for you, in terms of, do you currently have the ability to describe your data and make it transparent for users? Do you have the ability to communicate that with different stakeholders? Are you really involving customers, both internal and external, for each part of that process, whether it's new services, new capabilities, process changes internally? These are all the areas that you probably should be considering. But certainly time-wise, we're coming to an end, and we will, of course, as I mentioned, reach out to all users who've asked these questions. But maybe just a quick thank you, I guess, from me again. Thank you, everyone, for your time. Thank you for attending. Hopefully that's been really useful for you, some good, insightful content around some use cases and around how ABACUS can help. If there is anything further that needs to be added, obviously feel free to let us know as well.